The Forest of Three, that is what it is called. Nobody knows who named it or when. In fact, this secluded area is not labeled on maps. It has no official name, only the name given to it by the townsfolk who live on its edge, the Forest of Three. Perhaps it is named after the 3 tall redwoods that grow in its heart, 3 towering giants lifting their head far above the tree line. They stand in a circle with overgrown branches extended into each other's foliage, as if linking arms. When the wind howls, one can see them sway, their powerful roots supplying the great forces needed to prevent them from falling. Viewed from the correct angle, it can appear as if they are attempting to dance, to uproot themselves and skip in a circle with hands joined. The 3 redwoods have been left untouched for decades, although the ancient, well-seasoned wood would surely be profitable for the town's lumber industry. Not a single person has ever suggested cutting them down. The redwoods are viewed by the townsfolk as guardians of the forest, as protectors of the town. And a very small town it is. How many inhabitants are there? Nobody knows the exact count, for such details are of little concern, but it could not be more than a few hundred. During the daylight hours, the streets are occasionally filled with the lively sounds of children playing, running, skipping, shouting, and all manner of things that children are prone to do. However, the town itself is a rather boring place, and not the preferred playground of children. After all, the town sits next to a large forest. What better playground could a child ask for? Thousands of trees to climb, rocks to overturn, creatures and insects to be examined. A child could spend every day exploring the vast expanse of green, and never happen upon the same tree twice. Yes, the forest is a perfect place for children, a place for them to explore, to imagine, to learn. The children love the forest greatly. They even sing a nursery rhyme about it. Skipping in circles with hands joined, the children will chant, come play in the forest of three, you with I and I with thee. Oh, such fun we have in store, lurking there forevermore." Where this rhyme comes from, nobody knows. It is possible that the children themselves wrote it. Yet, upon examination, this theory seems implausible. Forevermore? Thee? Hardly words that a child would understand, let alone include in a song. No, this rhyme speaks of something old, something archaic, something beyond the understanding of children. For many years, life was peaceful in the small town. Nothing noteworthy occurred. There was no newspaper because there was never any news. A simple lumber town with a simple lumber industry, populated by simple people. Everything was as it should be. Nothing was out of place. Then a child disappeared. How long ago was this? Few remember the exact year. Several decades ago at least. A child whose only concern in life was sweets and playtime simply vanished. A town meeting was called. One of the other children claimed they had seen the missing child earlier that day, that the child had gone into the forest to play as usual and had not come back. A search party was immediately organized and sent into the forest. They searched for hours until the falling darkness did not permit them to search any longer. "We'll search again at first light. Everything will be fine. It's probably just a game. Don't worry so much." The townsfolk comforted the child's terrified parents. As soon as the first rays of sunlight crept through the trees, the search party was out again. They covered miles and miles, hardly stopping for rest or food, yet there was no trace of the missing child. Each day they searched, and with each day they came back with sore feet, hungry bellies, and no child. Hope was still there, but it was quickly fading. Each day, the search party came back sooner and sooner. Each day, they spent less and less time looking for the missing child before heading back. Eventually, the searches ceased entirely. If one were to examine the town at that time, at first glance, it would appear just as it had before. Men chopped woods, stores had good business, school was in session, children still played in the streets and in the forest. Of course, the family and friends of the missing child grieved, but nothing would seem out of the ordinary at first glance. Look closer and you would see it. The children, they played, they danced, they sang their nursery rhyme, yet there was something odd about their games. As they skipped in circles, arms together, chanting their favorite tune, there was a distinct gap. Where two children should have been holding hands, they instead held their arms to the side, creating a gap in the circle, a gap that seemed just large enough to make room for another child. During the rainy season, the children often had to play inside. The school had an ample supply of checkerboards, which were excellent at keeping the children's minds engaged. If one looked closely at the children playing checkers, you would notice a single lonely child. Whereas all the other children had partners to play checkers with, this child was on their own. Nevertheless, they seemed to be having a fine time, making moves for both sides of the board, and even becoming angry when they lost to their imaginary partner. Life in the town continued. The memory of the missing child faded with each year, until the other children scarcely remembered them. Soon, the children matured and had children of their own. The unfortunate, unsolved mystery of the child that went missing was slowly forgotten, until a second child vanished. The adults who remembered the original disappearance were disturbed. The disappearance of another child brought back painful memories. Many of them had been children themselves when the first child went missing, although they remembered very little about that child. Again, a town meeting was called. During the meeting, it surfaced that the child was last seen heading into the forest, eager to play, and again, a search party was formed. This search party fared no better than the one 15 years earlier. Although the forest was searched each day for hours, with many miles of land being covered, not a single trace of the child was ever found. Again, the search party was disbanded, leaving the family to grieve their loss. After a while, the town seemed to return to normal. Daily life resumed its normal course, just as it had so many years before. Yet if one looked closely at the children, you would notice the same curiosities witnessed 15 years before. The children skipped in circles singing the nursery rhyme that their parents had passed on to them. But again, there was a gap in their group, a void that was only apparent when they danced. This gap appeared to be just a little bit larger than the one before. Perhaps there was now room for the two extra children to join their happy group. During rainy days, when the children were stuck indoors playing with worn-out checker sets, there were no longer any lonely children. Every child had a partner to play with. However, laying unnoticed in the corner of the room, there was a solitary checker set. It had no players, no children to have fun with it. The pieces were scattered across the board, as if a game were currently in progress, yet there was nobody using it. Who can say what this meant? Maybe nothing. Children are prone to strange behavior, as any parent knows. A gap in their dancing circle, an unused checkerboard, why would any of these anomalies be cause for concern? In the end, it did not matter. No adult noticed the slightly unusual behavior of the children after either disappearance. Such was life in the small lumber town. Years continued to pass. Those who were children during the first disappearance became middle-aged. The friends of the second child who disappeared now had children of their own, and life passed by, completely normal. Until tonight, for tonight is a very special night. If one were to visit the town center, you would find it bustling with activity. Worried faces, loud arguments, and a weeping family is what you would find. You see, earlier today a child went into the forest to play and did not return. A town meeting has been called to discuss the best course of action. Many members of the town remember the initial disappearance, which occurred more than 3 decades ago. Some are saying that the disappearances are connected, that 2 disappearances could be a coincidence, but not 3. Some now believe that the forest is haunted, while others call them crazy. Early tomorrow morning, when the sun begins to rise, a search party was set out to find the missing child. Perhaps they will find the child, and perhaps not. Perhaps the child simply became lost while playing in the forest and could not find their way home. Or perhaps tomorrow, when the other children go outside to play and begin dancing in a circle, chanting their nursery rhyme, we will see a gap just large enough for 3 extra children to join. And so tonight I invite you to visit the Forest of 3. Early tomorrow, the determined search party will undoubtedly break the calm silence, the quiet serenity of the forest. But for the next few hours, all is still. Stroll through the tall, Broad redwoods, the thick brush, the moist soil, the trickling creeks. Gaze through the foliage into the night sky to see a bright starlight and thin gray wisps of clouds forming overhead. Eventually, you will arrive at the heart of the forest. Here stands 3 great redwoods, 100 feet taller and 100 years older than all others in the forest. They stand with their branches interwoven as if dancing in a circle. The wind howls. The trees begin to sway. Sharp shadows are cast upon the trunks of the great redwoods. The shadows move across the bark, and it appears as if the trees are snarling at you, sneering at some great joke that you cannot understand. The wind dies. Close your eyes. Listen for it. The soft rustle of leaves overhead, the quiet trickle of water through the streams, the small animals moving through the brush. Now it comes, so very distant, yet so very clear, an innocent chorus carrying a sinister tone, the voice of the forest of 3. Come play in the forest of 3, you with I and I with thee. Oh, such fun we have in store, lurking there forevermore. I know the topic of scary or rather disturbing stories from our childhoods are outdated and furthermore considered cliché, but I thought you might like this one. This one was from my high school years. I wasn't always rebellious. In fact, I was a good kid. I wasn't what you would call an angel of a child, but I was still keeping up appearances, had good grades, was disciplined enough, and I had pretty well developed manners. I hung out with this delinquent, Cody. He was an asshole, the biggest one you'd ever meet. Nobody really liked him, but he was quite wealthy, and while his parents were away, he would throw huge parties that half of the 10th grade students from my high school would go to. I was always invited to these, but he always started the parties late at night, around midnight, which meant my parents wouldn't let me go, so I didn't even bother asking. I know it wasn't my nature, and now that I look back, it was a really stupid choice, but I decided I would sneak out. My dad stayed up till 11 every night and never emerged from his bedroom until the following morning, and my mom always slept till noon, using beauty sleep as an excuse. Time came and it was the night of the party. It was about 11:30 and my dad had already stumbled into his bedroom and proceeded to snore loudly. I slowly twisted the handle of my door to reveal the inky blackness of the hallways. Now would be the perfect time to escape. If not now, never. He lived pretty far away. It would take at least an hour to get there by foot. I softly closed my door and lightly paced towards our sliding glass door. I opened it slowly. It must have been a minute before the opening was big enough for me to squeeze through. Once I was through, I took no risk and took another minute to close it again. I was outside, and the moon illuminated the ground quite well. I lived in the desert area, and there was really no threats at night, save for coyotes, but they rarely attack. I kept a pocket knife on me, however. They were usually more scared of you than you were of them, but this was just a precaution. You can't be too careful out here. There's also a fair amount of shady people for such a small town, but that didn't worry me. The terrain was rugged and difficult to navigate. I had to dodge tall brush and jump over eroded crevices in the earth. I checked my watch. It was around 12:15 and I knew that I must be close, because I saw a familiar house that I always passed by while walking on the sidewalk to get to Cody's house. Only a couple more blocks and I would have made it. The terrain had gotten surprisingly less jagged and smoother after a couple minutes. The ground was mainly free of rocks and other obstructions save for beer bottles and some dried up bushes. But there was one thing that caught my eye. There was a brown tarp lying next to the side of the ditch I was walking through. I stopped for a moment and observed it before my curiosity managed to claw its way through and I slowly approached it. It was probably just trash, but for some reason I felt inclined to see what it was. I nudged it with my foot, and a tall figure rose swiftly from under the cover. I was knocked back, frozen with fear. It was a bear-like creature that wore a dark brown trench coat and dusty brown pants. He was barefoot, and his feet larger than any creature I know of. The bear-like creature stood up. He had to have stood higher than 6'5", towering over me. Long white hair protruded from every visible inch of body there was, almost like an animal. Its glossy eyes met mine and I was ready to run. I managed to stutter out a few words. "What?" I stopped, examining the creature once more. "What are you?" The figure looked at me again and let out a hearty chuckle. He wiped a few tears of joy from under his eyes and gave me a smile.
"Why, my boy, I am Mr. Trenchfoot,"
he said, still grinning at me. His tone was nothing short of friendly, and that was the only thing stopping me from making a mad dash back to my house. He gave me a puzzled look and asked,
"Do you by chance know the date?"
I thought he was joking at first, and I laughed a bit. Then I saw his serious expression. I stuttered again, but managed to collect myself. "It's June 7th. He looked shocked, or rather intrigued. He looked at me again, and my eyes met his once more.
My, I have been asleep quite long. It was November last time I was awake. Now tell me, what have I missed?"
he said, still sounding jovial. We strangely got into a conversation, and it lasted a good 15 minutes. He asked me about politics and celebrities, but nothing too serious. We spoke for a while and I looked down at my watch. I had about 16 minutes to get to the party before it hit 1. I sat up on the rock from which I previously rested. "I have to get going," I said. Mr. Trenchfoot stood up and wiped dirt off his coat and coughed before speaking.
"Follow me."
He walked towards a storm drain that seemed to lead into blackness.
"I need to show you something,"
he said, entering it. His voice was all too friendly and inviting. He crawled further into the pipe, and soon he was enveloped in darkness. I dared not enter and stood there for a while. He turned, and the only reason I knew that is because the little bit of moonlight illuminated his eyes, just as it would a dog or a cat's. I stepped back a bit, a little frightened, and reminded him I had to go.
"Come here,"
he said softly. He repeated, and each time he got more angered and menacing.
"Come here. Come here. Come here."
He inched forward, just enough so I could see him fully. Long black claws protruded from his fingers. He clawed the sides as he repeated,
"Come here now. Come here now."
I ran as fast as I could back up the ditch I was walking in, daring not to look back to see if he was following until I was at a safe distance. After about a minute of running, I looked back and was relieved. He did not follow. He stood, watching, as the moon outlined his figure. I continued to run as fast as I think I've ever run. I hopped over my fence, this time not cautious of not making any noise, and I ran inside, tired and frightened. My dad heard my entrance and ran to see what the cause of the noise was. I explained that something had tried to attack me, and he called the police without hesitation. I explained to the police where it had happened and what I saw. They took no time to rush to the area and investigate. No sign of Mr. Trenchfoot. I was at the scene watching them at a safe distance with my mom and dad. I had shown the chief the drain pipe that Mr. Trenchfoot had tried to lure me in. He took no time to motion several armed officers inside. They didn't find him though, and they still haven't to this day. That was my story. Creepy, right? Things have been the same. I got grounded for a couple weeks, but they let me off because they were glad I was safe. So you could say that this had a happy ending. I guess for me at least. I still haven't told you the best part. You know how I said they didn't find him? Well, when they kicked open a grate, they entered a concrete room, no bigger than a walk-in closet. Again, they didn't find Mr. Trenchfoot in there. However, they did find something. They found Mr. Trenchfoot's tarp in there, still dusty as ever. There was no sign of Mr. Trenchfoot, or any life for that matter. There was another thing in the room. In the far corner of the dark, cold, concrete shelter was a pile of bloody, torn clothes, all of them belonging to children in my town that went missing in the last 20 years. Last year, I spent 6 months participating in what I was told was a psychological experiment. I found an ad in my local paper looking for imaginative people looking to make good money, and since it was the only ad that week that I was remotely qualified for, I gave them a call and we arranged an interview. They told me that all I would have to do was stay in a room, alone, with sensors attached to my head to read my brain activity, and while I was there I would visualize a double of myself. They called it my Tulpa. It seemed easy enough, and I agreed to do it as soon as they told me how much I would be paid. And the next day, I began. They brought me to a simple room and gave me a bed, then attached sensors to my head and hooked them into a little black box on the table beside me. They talked me through the process of visualizing my double again, and explained that if I got bored or restless, instead of moving around, I should visualize my double moving around, or try to interact with him, and so on. The idea was to keep him with me the entire time I was in the room. I had trouble with it for the first few days. It was more controlled than any sort of daydreaming I'd done before. I'd imagine my double for a few minutes, then grow distracted. But by the fourth day, I could manage to keep him present for the entire 6 hours. They told me I was doing very well. The second week, they gave me a different room with wall-mounted speakers. They told me they wanted to see if I could still keep the Tulpa with me in spite of distracting stimuli. The music was discordant, ugly, and unsettling, and it made the process a little more difficult, but I managed nonetheless. The next week, they played even more unsettling music, punctuated by shrieks, feedback loops, what sounded like an old-school modem dialing up, and guttural voices speaking some foreign language. I just laughed it off. I was a pro by then. After about a month, I started to get bored. To liven things up, I started interacting with my doppelganger. We'd have conversations or play rock, paper, scissors. Or I'd imagine him juggling, or breakdancing, or whatever caught my fancy. I asked the researchers if my foolishness would adversely affect their study, but they encouraged me. So we played and communicated, and that was fun for a while. Then, it got a little strange. I was telling him about my first date one day, and he corrected me. I'd said my date was wearing a yellow top, and he told me it was a green one. I thought about it for a second, and realized he was right. It creeped me out, and after my shift that day, I talked to the researchers about it. "You're using the thought form to access your subconscious," they explained. "You knew on some level that you were wrong, and subconsciously corrected yourself." What had been creepy was suddenly cool. I was talking to my subconscious. It took some practice, but I found that I could question my Tulpa and access all sorts of memories. I could make it quote whole pages of books I'd read once, years before, or things that I was taught and immediately forgot in high school. It was awesome. That was around the time I started calling up my double outside of the research center. Not often at first, but I was so used to imagining him by now that it almost seemed odd to not see him. So whenever I was bored, I'd visualize my double. Eventually I started doing it almost all the time. It was amusing to take him along like an invisible friend. I imagined him when I was hanging out with friends or visiting my mom. I even brought him along on a date once. I didn't need to speak to him out loud, so I was able to carry out conversations with him and no one was the wiser. I know it sounds strange, but it was fun. Not only was he a walking repository of everything I knew and everything I had forgotten, he also seemed more in touch with me than I did at times. He had an uncanny grasp of the minutiae of body language that I didn't even realize I was picking up on. For example, I thought the date I brought him along on was going badly, but he pointed out how she was laughing a little too hard at my jokes and leaning towards me as I spoke, and a bunch of other subtle clues I wasn't consciously picking up on. I listened, and let's just say that that date went very well. By the time I'd been at the research center for 4 months, he was with me constantly. The researchers approached me one day after my shift and asked if I'd stopped visualizing him. I denied it, and they seemed pleased. I silently asked my double if he knew what prompted that, but he just shrugged it off. So did I. I withdrew a little from the world at that point. I was having trouble relating to people. It seemed to me that they were so confused and unsure of themselves, while I had a manifestation of myself to confer with. It made socializing awkward. Nobody else seemed aware of the reasons behind their actions. why some things made them mad and others made them laugh. They didn't know what moved them, but I did, or at least I could ask myself and get an answer. A friend confronted me one evening. He pounded at the door until I answered it, and came in fuming and swearing up a storm. "You haven't answered when I called you in fucking weeks, you dick," he yelled. "What's your fucking problem?" I was about to apologize to him, and probably would have offered to hit the bars with him that night, but my Tulpa grew suddenly furious. "Hit him," it said, and before I knew what I was doing, I had. I heard his nose break. He fell to the floor and came up swinging, and we beat each other up and down my apartment. I was more furious then than I had ever been, and I was not merciful. I knocked him to the ground and gave him 2 savage kicks to the ribs. And that was when he fled, hunched over and sobbing. The police were by a few minutes later, but I told them that he had been the instigator, and since he wasn't around to refute me, they had to let me off with a warning. My Tulpa was grinning the entire time. We spent the night crowing about my victory and sneering over how badly I'd beaten my friend. It wasn't until the next morning, when I was checking out my black eye and cut lip in the mirror, that I remembered what had set me off. My double was the one who'd grown furious, not me. I had been feeling guilty and a little ashamed, but he goaded me into a vicious fight with a concerned friend. He was present, of course, and knew my thoughts. "You don't need him anymore. You don't need anyone else," he told me, and I felt my skin crawl. I explained all this to the researchers who employed me, but they laughed it off. "You can't be scared of something that you're imagining," one told me. My double stood beside him and nodded his head, then smirked at me. I tried to take their words to heart, but over the next few days I found myself growing more and more anxious around my Tulpa, and it seemed that he was changing. He looked taller and more menacing. His eyes twinkled with mischief, and I saw malice in his constant smile. No job was worth losing my mind over, I decided. If he was out of control, I put him down. I was so used to him at that point that visualizing him was an automatic process, so I started trying my damnedest not to visualize him. It took a few days, but it started to work somewhat. I could get rid of him for hours at a time, but every time he came back, he seemed worse. His skin seemed ashen, his teeth more pointed. He hissed and gibbered and threatened and swore. The discordant music I had been listening to for months seemed to accompany him everywhere. Even when I was home, I'd relax and slip up, no longer concentrating on not seeing him, and there he'd be, and that howling noise with him. I was still visiting the research center and spending my 6 hours there. I needed the money, and I thought they weren't aware that I was actively not visualizing my Tulpa. I was wrong. After my shift one day, about 5.5 months in, 2 impressive men grabbed and restrained me, and someone in a lab coat jabbed a hypodermic needle into my body. I woke up from my stupor back in the room, strapped into the bed, music blaring, with my doppelganger standing over me and cackling. He hardly looked human anymore. His features were twisted, his eyes were sunken in their sockets and filmed over like a corpse's. He was much taller than me, but hunched over. His hands were twisted and his fingernails were like talons. He was, in short, fucking terrifying. I tried to will him away, but I couldn't seem to concentrate. He giggled and tapped the IV in my arm. I thrashed in my restraints as best as I could, but could hardly move at all. "They're pumping you full of the good shit, I think. How's the mind, all fuzzy?" He leaned closer and closer as he spoke. I gagged. His breath smelled like spoiled meat. I tried to focus, but couldn't banish him. The next few weeks were terrible. Every so often, someone in a doctor's coat would come in and inject me with something, or force feed me a pill. They kept me dizzy and unfocused, and sometimes left me hallucinating or delusional. My thought form was still present, constantly mocking. He interacted with, or perhaps caused, my delusions. I hallucinated that my mother was there, scolding me, and then he cut her throat and her blood showered me. It was so real that I could taste it. The doctors never spoke to me. I begged at times, screamed, hurled incentives, demanded answers. They never spoke to me. They may have talked to my Tulpa, my personal monster. I'm not sure. I was so doped and confused that it may have just been more delusion, but I remember them talking with him. I grew convinced that he was the real one, and I was the thought form. He encouraged that line of thought at times, mocked me at others. Another thing that I pray was a delusion. He could touch me. More than that, he could hurt me. He'd poke and prod at me if he felt I wasn't paying enough attention to him. Once he grabbed my testicles and squeezed until I told him I loved him. Another time, he slashed my forearms with one of his talons. I still have a scar. Most days I can convince myself that I'm the one that caused the injury and just hallucinated that he was responsible. Most days. Then one day, while he was telling me a story about how he was going to get everyone I loved, starting with my sister, he paused. A querulous look crossed his face, and he reached out to touch my head, like my mother used to when I was feverish. He stayed still for a long moment, and then he smiled. "All thoughts are creative," he told me. Then he walked out the door. 3 hours later, I was given an injection and passed out. I awoke unrestrained. Shaking, I made my way to the door and found it unlocked. I walked out into the empty hallway and then ran. I stumbled more than once, but I made it down the stairs and out into the lot behind the building. There, I collapsed, weeping like a child. I knew I had to keep moving, but I couldn't manage it. I got home eventually, but I don't remember how. I locked the door and shoved a dresser against it, took a long shower and slept for a day and a half. Nobody came for me in the night, and nobody came for me the next day, or the day after that. It was over. I'd spent a week locked in that room, but it had felt like a century. I'd withdrawn so much from my life beforehand that nobody had even known I was missing. The police didn't find anything. The research center was empty when they searched it. The paper trail fell apart. The names I'd given them were aliases. Even the money I'd received was apparently untraceable. I recovered as much as one can. I don't leave the house much, and I have panic attacks when I do. I cry a lot, I don't sleep much, and my nightmares are terrible. It's over, I tell myself. I survived. I used the concentration those bastards taught me to convince myself. It works sometimes. Not today, though. 3 days ago, I got a phone call from my mother. There's been a tragedy. My sister's the latest victim in a spree of killings. The police say the perpetrator mugs his victims, then guts them. The funeral was this afternoon. It was as lovely as a funeral service can be, I suppose. I was a little distracted, though. All I could hear was music coming from somewhere distant, discordant, unsettling stuff that sounds like feedback and shrieking, and a modem dialing up. I hear it still, a little louder now. The Lavender Town Syndrome, also known as Lavender Town Tone or Lavender Town Suicides, was a peak in suicides and illness of children between the ages of 7 to 12, shortly after the release of Pokemon Red and Green in Japan, back in February 27, 1996. Rumors say that these suicides and illnesses only occurred after the children playing the game reached Lavender Town, whose theme music had extremely high frequencies that studies showed that only children and young teens can hear, since their ears are more sensitive. Due to the Lavender Tone, at least 200 children supposedly committed suicide, and many more developed illnesses and afflictions. The children who committed suicide usually did so by hanging or jumping from heights. Those who did not acted irrationally and complained of severe headaches after listening to the Lavender Town's theme. Although Lavender Town now sounds completely differently depending on the game, this mass hysteria was caused by the first Pokemon game released. After the Lavender Tone incident, the programmers had fixed Lavender Town's theme music to be at a lower frequency, and since then children were no longer affected by it. One video appeared in 2010 using special software to analyze the audio of Lavender Town's music. When played, the software created images of the unknown near the end of the audio. This raised a controversy since the unknown didn't appear until the Generation 2 games, Silver, Gold, and Crystal. The unknown translate to, "Leave now." During my childhood, my family was like a drop of water in a vast river, never remaining in one location for long. We settled in Rhode Island when I was 8, and there we remained until I went to college in Colorado Springs. Most of my memories are rooted in Rhode Island, but there are fragments in the attic of my brain which belong to various homes we had lived in when I was much younger. Most of these memories are unclear and pointless. Chasing after another boy in the backyard of a house in North Carolina, trying to build a raft to float on the creek behind the apartment we rented in Pennsylvania, and so on. But there is one set of memories which remains as clear as glass, as though they were made just yesterday. I often wonder whether these memories are simply lucid dreams, produced by the long sickness I experienced that spring, but in my heart, I know they are real. We were living in a house just outside the bustling metropolis of New Vineyard, Maine, population 643. It was a large structure, especially for a family of 3. There were a number of rooms that I didn't see in the 5 months we resided there. In some ways it was a waste of space, but it was the only house on the market at the time, at least within an hour's commute to my father's place of work. The day after my 5th birthday, attended by my parents alone, I came down with a fever. The doctor said I had mononucleosis, which meant no rough play and more fever for at least another 3 weeks. It was horrible timing to be bedridden. We were in the process of packing our things to move to Pennsylvania, and most of my things were already packed away in boxes, leaving my room barren. My mother brought me a ginger ale and books several times a day, and these served the function of being my primary form of entertainment for the next few weeks. Boredom always loomed just around the corner, waiting to rear its ugly head and compound my misery. I don't exactly recall how I met Mr. Widemouth. I think it was about a week after I was diagnosed with mono. My first memory of the small creature was asking him if he had a name. He told me to call him Mr. Widemouth, because his mouth was large. In fact, everything about him was large in comparison to his body. His head, his eyes, his crooked ear, but his mouth was the largest by far. "You look kinda like a Furby," I said as he flipped through one of my books. Mr. Widemouth stopped and gave me a puzzled look. "Furby? What's a Furby?" he asked. I shrugged. "You know, the toy? The little robot with big ears? You can pet and feed him? Almost like a real pet." "Oh," Mr. Widemouth resumed his activity. "You don't need one of those. They aren't the same as having a real friend." I remember Mr. Widemouth disappearing every time my mother stopped by to check in on me. "I lay under your bed," he later explained. "I don't want your parents to see me because I'm afraid they won't let us play anymore." We didn't do much during those first few days. Mr. Widemouth just looked at my books, fascinated by the stories and pictures they contained. The 3rd or 4th morning after I met him, he greeted me with a large smile on his face. "I have a new game we can play," he said. "We have to wait until after your mother comes to check on you, because she can't see us play it. It's a secret game." After my mother delivered more books and soda at the usual time, Mr. Widemouth slipped out from under the bed and tugged at my hand. "We have to go to the room at the end of this hallway." I objected at first, as my parents had forbidden me to leave my bed without their permission. But Mr. Widemouth persisted until I gave in. The room in question had no furniture or wallpaper. Its only distinguishing feature was a window opposite of the doorway. Mr. Widemouth darted across the room and gave the window a firm push, flinging it open. He then beckoned me to look out at the ground window. We were on the 2nd story of the house, but it was on a hill, and from this angle the drop was farther than 2 stories due to the incline. "I like to play pretend up here. I pretend that there is a big, soft trampoline below this window, and I jump. If you pretend hard enough, you bounce back up like a feather. I want you to try." I was a 5-year-old with a fever, so only a hint of skepticism darted through my thoughts as I looked down and considered the possibility. "It's a long drop," I said. "But that's all a part of the fun. It wouldn't be fun if it was only a short drop. If it were that way, you may as well just bounce on a real trampoline." I toyed with the idea, picturing myself falling through thin air only to bounce back to the window on something unseen by human eyes. But the realist in me prevailed. "Maybe another time. I don't know if I have enough imagination. I could get hurt." Mr. Widemouth's face contorted into a snarl, but only for a moment. Anger gave way to disappointment. if you say so. He spent the rest of the day under my bed, quiet as a mouse. The following morning, Mr. Widemouth arrived holding a small box. I want to teach you how to juggle. Here are some things you can use to practice before I start giving you lessons. I looked in the box. It was full of knives. My parents will kill me. Horrified that Mr. Widemouth had brought knives into my room, objects that my parents would never allow me to touch. I'll be spanked and grounded for a year. Mr. Widemouth frowned. It's fun to juggle with these. I want you to try it. I pushed the box away. I can't. I'll get in trouble. Knives aren't safe to just throw in the air. Mr. Widemouth's frown deepened into a scowl. He took the box of knives and slid under my bed, remaining there for the rest of the day. I began to wonder how often he was under me. I started having trouble sleeping after that. Mr. Widemouth often woke me up at night, saying he put a real trampoline under the window, a big one that I couldn't see in the dark. I always declined and tried to go back to sleep, but Mr. Widemouth persisted. Sometimes he stayed by my side until early morning, encouraging me to jump. He wasn't so fun to play with anymore. My mother came to me one morning and told me I had her permission to walk around outside. She thought the fresh air would be good for me, especially after being confined to my room for so long. Ecstatic, I put on my sneakers and trotted out to the back porch, yearning for the feeling of the sun on my face. Mr. Widemouth was waiting for me. I have something I want you to see. I must have given him a weird look, because he then said, It's safe, I promise. I followed him to the beginning of a deer trail, which ran through the woods behind the house. This is an important path. I've had lots of friends about your age. When they were ready, I took them down this path to a special place. You aren't ready yet, but one day, I hope to take you there. I returned to the house, wondering what kind of place lay beyond that trail. 2 weeks after I met Mr. Widemouth, the last load of things had been packed into the moving truck. I would be in the cab of that truck, sitting next to my father for the long drive to Pennsylvania. I considered telling Mr. Widemouth that I would be leaving, but even at 5 years old, I was beginning to suspect that perhaps the creature's intentions were not to my benefit, despite what he said otherwise. For this reason, I decided to keep my departure a secret. My father and I were in the truck at 4 a.m. He was hoping to make it to Pennsylvania by lunchtime tomorrow, with the help of an endless supply of coffee and a 6-pack of energy drinks. He seemed to be more like a man who was about to run a marathon, rather than one who was about to spend 2 days sitting still. Early enough for you? My father asked with a hint of sympathy. I nodded and placed my head against the window, hoping for some sleep before the sun came up. I felt my father's hand on my shoulder. This is the last move, son, I promise. I know it's hard for you, as sick as you've been. Once Daddy gets promoted, we can settle down and you can make friends. I opened my eyes as we backed out of the driveway. I saw Mr. Widemouth's silhouette in my bedroom window. He stood there motionless until the truck was about to turn onto the main road. He gave me a pitiful little wave goodbye, steak knife in hand. I didn't wave back. Years later, I returned to New Vineyard. The piece of land our house stood upon was empty except for the foundation, as the house burned down a few years after my family left. Out of curiosity, I followed the deer trail that Mr. Widemouth had shown me. Part of me expected him to jump out from behind a tree and scare the living bejesus out of me, but I felt that Mr. Widemouth was gone, somehow tied to the house that no longer existed. The trail ended at the New Vineyard Memorial Cemetery. I noticed that many of the tombstones belonged to children. I recently spawned a new world in single-player Minecraft. Everything was normal at first as I began chopping down trees and crafting a workbench, when I noticed something move amongst the dense fog. I have a very old computer, so I have to play with a tiny render distance. I thought it was a cow, so I pursued it, hoping to grab some hides for armor. It wasn't a cow though. Looking back at me was another character with the default skin, but his eyes were empty. I saw no name pop up, and I double-checked to make sure I wasn't in multiplayer mode. He didn't stay long, though. He looked at me quickly and ran into the fog. I pursued out of curiosity, but he was gone. I continued on with the game, not sure what to think of it. As I expanded the world, I saw things that seemed out of place for a random map generator to make. 2x2 tunnels in the rocks, small perfect pyramids made out of sand in the ocean, and groves of trees with all their leaves cut off. I would constantly think I saw the other player in the deep fog, but I never got a better look at him. I tried increasing my render distance to far whenever I thought I saw him, but to no avail. I saved the map and went on the forums to see if anyone else had found the pseudo-player. There were none. I created my own topic telling of a man and asking if anyone had a similar experience. The post was deleted within 5 minutes. I tried again, and the topic was deleted even faster. I received a PM from username Herobrine containing one word: stop. When I went to look at Herobrine's profile, the page 404'd, I received an email from another forum user. He claimed the mods can read the forum user messages, so we were safer using email. The emailer claimed that he had seen the mystery player too, and had a small directory of other users who had seen him as well. Their worlds were littered with obviously man-made features as well, and described their mystery player to have no pupils. About a month had passed until I heard from my informant again. Some of the people who had encountered the mystery man had looked into the name Herobrine, and found that name to be used frequently by a Swedish gamer. After some information gathering, it was revealed to be the brother of Hatsune Miku, the game's developer. I personally emailed Miku and asked her if she had a brother. It took her a while, but she emailed me back a very short message. I did, but he is no longer with us. It was approximately 12:15 when I entered the Johnson County Community Health Clinic. I was there for an appointment I had set up weeks ago, just a routine checkup. It wasn't a new place for me. I had been there a couple times before. However, the place had an odd nostalgic feel to it, as if it were a location from my childhood or something, and I could never pinpoint exactly what this feeling was or where it came from. As I walked in, an overwhelming feeling of déjà vu swept over me. The hum of the flickering fluorescent lights, the white tile flooring, the muted beige paint that colored the walls. I noticed that there was a TV mounted in the corner, a smaller flat screen, that was playing a short PowerPoint slideshow on a loop of ads and events that were being held by the clinic. I passed the empty waiting area, a small area of the main room with magazines, children's playthings, and blue cushioned chairs, and approached the woman at the front desk. She was sitting in her bluish-gray office chair, looking at a spreadsheet on the same Windows XP desktop they've had since 2008. There was a sign-in sheet on the counter in front of me. "I have an appointment with Dr. Pevins," I asked. "What time?" 12:30, I replied. She began typing something into her keyboard.
"Ah, yes,"
she responded.
"Gary Johnson?"
"Mm-hmm."
"Yes, I'll tell the doctor. Please fill this out."
She handed me a clipboard which held a simple fill-out form. I walked back to the waiting area, took a seat, and began to fill out the form. I was about halfway done with filling in my information when I slumped back in my chair. I hadn't gotten much sleep the night prior, and I was exhausted. As I slumped back, I noticed something very peculiar. My head never hit the wall. In fact, it felt like it went in. I got up quite frightened and looked at the wall. Nothing, not a single hole or dent had been made in the wall by my head. So, I reached to touch the wall, and my fingers went through it. I recoiled in shock. What the hell was that? I thought, as I reached to touch the wall again, only to find my fingers clipped through once more. Then, suddenly, I lost my balance, tripped, and fell directly through the wall. I fell, face first, onto some dirty tan carpeting. Upon getting back up, I realized that I was in a completely different room. Well, not really a room per se, more so a set of rooms, all of which were connected by openings. The walls were covered in gross tan patterned wallpaper. There was also an overwhelming stench of moist carpet. I turned back around and tried to put my hand through the wall, and it wouldn't go through. "Okay, what the fuck?" I muttered. I looked back into the room. There were no windows, no doors, nothing on the walls. Other than that disgusting wallpaper, of course. It was completely empty aside from a singular plastic blue school chair. At this point, the only thing going through my mind was fear and the repeating thought of, "I need to leave," on loop in my head. I started running through the rooms, desperately trying to find an exit, but to no avail. There was no exit. Was this my permanent location until I died? No, there has to be a way out. I wasn't going to be left here, right? Eventually someone would notice that I was gone. But nobody did. Then, in the distance, I heard footsteps, but not those of a human's, at least not a normal human. Alongside the footsteps was a gurgling snarl, like that of an angry animal. I began to run. I ran as fast as I could from whatever the hell was approaching me. I didn't want anything to do with it. I ran for what seemed like forever, but I was always back in the same room I started in. At least, it looked like the same room, not that I could tell them apart. So, I sat down, defeated. A feeling of dread filled my body as I started to cry. I was going to die here. I'm still there. I haven't left. I've accepted my fate. In fact, I can actually hear the footsteps. I wonder who that is. Thanks for listening, and remember, you cannot hide from the void.